Okay, this is the annotation of Exposure by Wilfred Owen for GCSE poetry, and as I say to my students, I tend to use 3 different colours for annotation, so pink for language, purple for structure and green for context, as you will see here. So in terms of context, which is in green, Wilfred Owen fought and was killed in World War I. He entered the war feeling patriotic and ended up cynical. He suffered with PTSD during the war years. So unlike Charge of the Light Brigade that you might have already studied or you'll come to study, this is a negative depiction of war. It's not a patriotic depiction of war, and unlike Charge of the Light Brigade, it's quite depressing in its tone. There's no glory in it. Exposure was written in the trenches shortly before Owen was killed, and the poem narrates the tedium and anxiety of trench warfare. So part of the reason why this is more of a negative poem is because Owen was experienced in the war, and unlike Charge of the Light Brigade, where Tennyson was imagining what war must be like from the reports that he'd read, this was somebody who'd actually been in the trenches and experienced war firsthand, which will explain why it is more negative. So there's a regular rhyme scheme. So this is your purple annotation, A, B, B, A, C, and this regular rhyme scheme could be argued to reflect the monotony of the soldier's experience. And interestingly, Exposure, even though it's about World War I, is about the tedium of being in the trenches and that anxiety of waiting for something to happen, because they quite often spent days just waiting around in poor conditions. There are half rhymes used, which shows a disruption to the routine, perhaps by fire or a battle or just anxiety. It could also show that soldiers feel unfulfilled, or it could show confusion. So there are different ways of interpreting the half rhymes. Each stanza ends with a half line which mirrors the anticipation felt by the soldiers. So there's almost that physical gap in the end line to show this gap in time that they're experiencing, that kind of hold your breath moment because they don't know what's going to happen. There are 8 stanzas, but like trench warfare, there's no real progression from first to last, which kind of echoes the war really. Every day they may make a tiny gain in terms of how much land they managed to capture, but it took forever. First person plural and written in present tense, which shows a collective experience. So first stanza. Immediately we begin with Our Brains Ache, which sets a sombre tone from the outset. It's a collective pronoun, which is a shared experience, so the emphasis here is placed on the fact that all soldiers feel the same way, and Owen is kind of the mouthpiece for those soldiers. It could be referring to a literal headache because of the cold, or because of fatigue, or it could be a metaphorical headache from the anguish that the soldiers are feeling, or the disappointment that they're feeling. The weather is personified, and you'll see this a lot through this poem. This time it's the merciless iced east winds that knife us, and this personification demonises the weather by using merciless and kniving us, both of those things showing how aggressive the weather is, that they have become a villain and an enemy for the soldiers, perhaps more so than the Germans. The ellipsis here reflects the anticipation that the soldiers feel, and this is used a lot throughout the poem. The asyndetic list here of whisper, curious, nervous shows the strength of emotion that the soldiers are feeling. So they're feeling confused, they're worried, they're whispering, they're curious, they're nervous. These are the sensations and these are the emotions that they have to deal with on a daily basis. And despite the fact that they feel so anxious and het up, the refrain, "but nothing happens," is repeated to show that nothing does happen. So they've got all of this nervous energy pulsing through them, but sometimes they can go days without any action, any of this glorified war that they were told that they were going to experience when they signed up. And maybe this questions what they're actually waiting for. Are they waiting for death? Are they waiting for battle? Are they waiting to go home? Are they waiting to win? Are they waiting to lose? It's unclear in the first stanza. So moving on to the second stanza, the simile here. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. So the simile compares brambles with barbed wire, and you'll see that the whole way through this poem nature is demonised because the soldiers feel that nature is also attacking them in a way that the enemy attacks them. And this reference to barbed wire obviously was used quite widely in World War I in trench warfare, but also refers to how dangerous the brambles can be. The biblical allusion here, when it talks about the flickering gunnery rumbles far off like a dull rumour of some other war, is a biblical allusion to Jesus' foretelling of the end of the world when he said, "You will hear of wars and rumours of wars." And perhaps Owen is using this to suggest that that's how he feels. He feels like it's the end of the world. Even though they can only hear rumours of wars and they can only hear things in the distance, there's an inevitability that this is going to end the world. And the change in the refrain here, "What are we doing here?" echoes the soldier's thought pattern, or the narrator's thought pattern. And this rhetorical question shows how disillusioned the soldier is. What are they doing here? What are they waiting for? Why did they sign up? This wasn't what they were expecting it to be. In the third stanza, we have the poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. And it's almost a juxtaposition here with the misery of dawn, because dawn is usually a positive time of the day. It's a new beginning, new day, bright sunshine, you get that kind of idea, the birds singing. However, it's referred to as misery of dawn. And this could refer contextually to the fact that dawn tended to be the time where a lot of the battles were fought, dawn and dusk, because of the way that the light hid things but allowed enough light to be able to go about your business. So that might be why this is referred to as the misery of dawn. The sibilance of "war lasts, rain soaks and clouds sag stormy" just adds to this incredibly melancholic tone, and it also echoes the sound of rain as well, because that's what's being described in this particular stanza. Dawn massing in the east her melancholy army. So this again is personification of the weather, and dawn specifically this time, talking about how she's amassing her rain, which is her melancholy army, but also this shows how demonized the weather is, that it feels like dawn is rising in order to attack the soldiers. And they're talking about the shivering ranks of grey, which could refer to the rain, or it could refer to the lifelessness of the setting, or it could reflect contextually on the Germans, because the Germans wore grey uniform. And perhaps by doing that, Owen is directly linking the enemy, or the Germans, with the weather, which is also their enemy now. We've got a repetition of the sibilance of "Streak the Silence." This time it echoes the rain, but also echoes the sound of bullets. And it just shows that it's unending, because it's repeated in this stanza as well as the last stanza. And now we're moving on to a different type of weather. We're moving on to snow. So we've had wind, we've had rain, now we're having snow. It shows the relentlessness of the weather that these soldiers are having to put up with. However, this snow is described as black with snow, which could suggest that the snow has lost its purity, perhaps as a consequence of war. So even the weather is subject to being defiled by the war. There are flowing flakes that flock, and this lovely alliteration of F echoes the sound of that snowfall. So we've previously had the sibilance, which echoes the sound of the rain, and now we've got the echoing sound of the snowfall. And the transition from the rain to snow shows that the enemy is ever present, but almost takes on different guises and gets more and more difficult to withstand and to tolerate. The pale flakes are also described as having fingering stealth, which makes them seem really insidious. This personification of them trying to come in and to be really deceitful, that they can't get away from them. It's an enemy that's really smart. And then we've got a bit of a comparison here between snow-dazed and sun-dozed. So the soldiers here start to reflect on their home life and use that as almost a fantasy that they try to escape to in this weather. The half rhyme between them enables the comparison between the present and the past. So the present is the snow-dazed and the past is the sun-dozed. I know which one I'd rather be in, which would be the sun-dozed. And I think that's what the soldier's trying to say here. And the pastoral imagery of blossoms trickling and blackbirds fussing just emphasises the comparison between the past and the present and how idyllic it seemed before. The final question says, is it that we are dying? And is this a response to stanza 2 and stanza 1? What are we doing here? What are we waiting for? Are they just waiting to die? The assonance in this first line of slowly our ghosts drag home emphasises the laboriousness of the journey. So perhaps the journey of them having to leave their fantasy world or their memory and return to the present, or actually what they're having to do, the labour they're having to engage with whilst they're in the trenches. The fact that they are described metaphorically as ghosts could be symbolic of the emptiness that the soldiers feel, or the idea of what they're like when they return home. They feel like they have changed. They're not really the person they were. Something's missing from them now than before they went to war, and that could be a reference to PTSD. So when talking about home, they're talking about these animals taking over their home. So we've got crickets and mice, which could be considered to be vermin type animals, generally ones you wouldn't want in your house. And actually this is a really important comparison, because Owen is talking about how these particular animals can enjoy the comforts that the soldiers cannot. So the crickets and the mice almost have a better deal than the soldiers do. And the caesura at the end of this line reflects the forgotten soldiers, so that kind of pause that they have, the doors are closed on them, and almost like a full stop there. There's nothing that they can do about that. And then they turn back to their dying. So they turn back from the lovely idea of home and the fires and everything seeming really lovely and dark red jewels, and now their present is the dying. And this part, with the contextual side of it, reasserts the reasons they are fighting. So since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn. So this is the assertion that the reason why they're fighting is so that other people at home can experience the fires, and they can experience comfort, and they can experience the sunshine and the pastoral imagery. So even though this is a really small part of the poem, there's still that belief that that's why they're fighting. And God's invincible spring, our love is made afraid. This is very similar to the melancholy dawn. This echoes that idea that spring brings fear. So spring generally is what we think of: baby lambs, baby chicks, Easter, lovely time, it's starting to get warmer. However, for the soldiers, this is a time of fear, because the battles tended to increase during the spring because the conditions were better. And this actually just shows how destructive war is. It destroys the joy in everything. And the final part of this stanza, where the narrator questions, "For love of God seems dying," is this a religious conflict? Do the soldiers feel like they've been forgotten by God, or do they feel like they are being punished by God? Tonight the frost will fasten on this mud and us. So mud and us is combined with this connective, and that might mean that mud and the soldiers are equalised. So there's an equality between them, that they're the same as each other, and that dehumanises the soldiers again. And you'll see that in bayonet charge. The vivid image of the impact of exposure is shown in this line, with the shrivelling hands and the puckering forehead. So really vivid imagery of what people look like should they be exposed to these kinds of conditions. The half-known faces that the narrator is talking about could be about the forgotten soldiers, so no one really remembers them. At home, perhaps, that the people in Britain are starting to lose faith in the war, so they're forgetting about them. Are they unrecognisable because of the weight they've lost or the stress that they've had to endure as a result of the war? Or is it just referring to the dead soldiers? And then their eyes are described as ice, and this metaphor could talk about the fact that these soldiers are dead or emotionless, so they kind of walk around like ghosts, as referred to previously in the poem, and they aren't feeling anything anymore. They've had to cut that part of themselves off. Or are they just so consumed by the weather that they are literally turning into the weather?